Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we are opening up a document that it feels less like a dusty historical record and more like finding a piece of unexploded ordnance in your backyard.
That's a really good way to put it.
It's heavy, it's heated, and honestly, if you handle it wrong, it might just blow up your entire understanding of the colonial era.
It really is a volatile piece of text. We're looking at an opening address that was delivered on November 18th, 1982 in Conakry, Guinea.
And the speaker is a major figure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The speaker is none other than Ahmed Sékou Touré, who was the president of the People's Revolutionary Republic of Guinea at the time.
Right. And just to set the stage for everyone listening, this wasn't just some, casual fireside chat. This was the keynote for a major international seminar.
It was, organized by his own Democratic Party of Guinea and, interestingly, the World Peace Council.
The title of the seminar alone tells you we aren't here for a polite revisionist tea party. Get this, the topic was African resistance to colonial penetration.
Which is a fascinating framing right off the bat, isn't it?
It really is.
Because usually, when you read standard Western histories of this era, the focus is always on the scramble for Africa. The agency is almost always given to the colonizers, the British, the French, the Germans drawing lines on a map in Berlin.
They're the ones doing things. Everyone else is just sort of being acted upon.
Exactly. But Touré flips the camera angle immediately.
Huh.
He's not interested in the penetration per se. He's interested in the resistance to it.
That's the core mission of this deep dive then, isn't it? We always hear that cliche, history is written by the victors. It's such a truism that we barely even think about what it means. But here we have a case where the conquered, and I'm using that term very loosely because Touré would definitely dispute it.
It absolutely would.
He decides to seize the narrative. He's basically saying, put down your colonial textbooks. Here is what actually happened from our perspective.
Yes, and it's not just a recounting of battles. If you go into this expecting just a dry list of dates and wars, you're completely missing the point. Touré is constructing a comprehensive philosophical argument.
So it's theory as much as history.
It is. He's arguing that African resistance wasn't just a series of sporadic, disconnected flare-ups by unruly natives, which is, often how the colonial logs describe them.
Right, like they were just troublemakers.
He's arguing the resistance was a continuous, sophisticated, and culturally deeply rooted phenomenon that spanned the entire continent.
A systemic rejection of foreign domination. And what struck me reading through this is the sheer scope of it. It's part political manifesto, part history lesson, and part eulogy, almost.
That's a great word for it.
We've got these incredibly cinematic backstories of kings and queens. We have suicides inside besieged fortresses. And then we have this very high-level analysis of how guns and books were used as dual weapons.
The guns and books metaphor is absolutely essential. We'll definitely get to that in a moment, but it really forces you to rethink the mechanics of conquest.
It's not just about brute force.
Not at all. It wasn't just about bullets.
So let's dive right in. The mission for us today is to really unpack Touré's argument. We want to understand how he sees this resistance, not just as a military thing, but as a defense of humanity itself. And to do that, we have to start where he starts.
With the myth of the civilizing mission.
Oh, the famous civilizing mission. This was basically the PR campaign for colonialism, right?
It was a perfect justification. The idea that Europe wasn't conquering Africa for profit, but out of some, altruistic desire to bring light to the dark continent.
Right. The whole white man's burden narrative. We aren't conquering you, we're helping you. It's the ultimate gaslight.
Precisely. And Touré dismantles this right out of the gate with a very, very interesting sociological argument. He starts by talking about the structure of pre-colonial African societies. He describes them as developing vertically.
Vertically. Okay,
Yeah.
Let's unpack this. What does he mean by vertical development in this context? It sounds almost architectural, but he's talking about something else. He's talking about sovereignty, isn't he?
He is. Think of vertical as the axis of dignity and independence. He argues that for thousands of years, African peoples, whether we're talking about the great empires of Mali or Songhai or even smaller clan-based societies, they organized their lives independently.
So they stood on their own.
They stood tall. They had their own laws, their own ethics, their own administrative systems. They answered to themselves and their own gods. That is the vertical axis standing upright, independent of any external reference points.
So the idea that they were just sitting around in a vacuum waiting for Europe to show up and tell them how to run a society is...
It's absurd. He paints a picture of a continent with a rich, long history of self-governance.
Okay, so that's the vertical part. But then
Yeah.
he pairs this with a second axis.
He does. He points out that while the society stood vertically sovereign, they managed their wealth horizontally. This is a crucial distinction he makes.
So vertical independence, but horizontal solidarity.
Exactly. Wealth was shared among clans and tribes. It wasn't about individual accumulation or the hoarding of surplus for its own sake. The goal was collective survival and prosperity. It was a system designed for social cohesion, not individual profit.
A communal structure.
A deeply communal structure. The well-being of the group was paramount.
And then in comes the colonizer. And Touré sets up this sharp contrast between the African model and the European model he's critiquing.
A very sharp contrast. He describes the colonial system as being driven entirely by what he calls the instinct of profit.
The instinct of profit, that's a strong phrase.
It is. He says it's a system completely obsessed with surplus. And he argues that this relentless drive for profit inevitably, necessarily, leads to dehumanization.
Why inevitably?
Because you cannot exploit a people for profit if you see them as fully human equals. It's psychologically impossible.
Huh.
You have to lower their status first. You have to convince yourself and the rest of the world that they are lesser, that they need you to rule them.
That's where the civilizing mission comes in as the justification.
It's the perfect cover story. We're not here for your gold and your rubber. We're here for your soul.
And he actually gets pretty specific about this dehumanization. He quotes a poem from the mid-19th century to illustrate this exact mindset. It's titled The Colonization of Africa. And honestly, when I read this part of the source text, my jaw dropped.
It's shocking to read today.
It's almost cartoonishly evil, but it was real propaganda at the time.
You're talking about the specific lines regarding light and liberty.
Yes. The poem basically claims that the colonizers are bringing light and liberty, but then you listen to the imagery Touré highlights. The poet says that to bring this light, they have to burn settlements and bomb fortifications.
It's a jarring contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
It's completely insane. We will burn your house down to set you free.
Exactly. It reminds me of that terrible logic from the Vietnam War era. We had to destroy the village to save it.
It's that same twisted logic 100 years earlier.
And Touré calls it out for what it is, a facade. He points out the sheer absurdity of claiming that invading territories and massacring people is a valid way to introduce them to light.
Oh,
But this leads us to that incredible metaphor we mentioned earlier.
the guns in the books.
The guns in the books.
This is where it gets really interesting for me, because usually in the Western liberal tradition, we view the book, literacy, education, schooling, as the antidote to violence. The pen is mightier than the sword, right?
That's the cliche, yes.
But Touré says, not so fast.
He argues that for the colonizer, the book was just another weapon. It was a different tool for the same job. He quotes that same poem again, where it explicitly says the goal is to lay down arms by substituting books for them.
So the book is a pacifier. It's the second stage of the invasion.
It's a tool of domination. If the gun conquers the body, the book conquers the mind.
Wow.
It replaces your history with their history, your language with their language, your values with their values. It's what Touré calls depersonalization.
That is a terrifying concept. It's like a software overwrite for an entire culture.
It is. And think about the efficiency of it. If I conquer you with a gun, I have to keep the gun pointed at you forever. That's expensive, it's resource intensive.
And it creates martyrs.
Yes. But if I conquer you with a book, if I teach you that your ancestors were savages and my ancestors were heroes, then eventually I can put the gun down.
Because you will police yourself.
You will police yourself, you will aspire to be like me, you will see your own culture as inferior. The colonization becomes internal.
And Touré argues that African resistance was explicitly a rejection of this overwrite. It wasn't just fighting for a piece of land, it was a fight for human dignity.
A fight for the very definition of who they were. He references modern anthropology, what was then modern anthropology, to remind the audience that Africa is the cradle of mankind.
Which is a fact we kind of take for granted now, but in 1982, and certainly during the colonial era, that was a radical assertion of equality.
Absolutely. He's saying, we are the original humans. We developed society first. We are not your children. So when the slave trade treated the African man as raw material, he uses the chilling phrase, ebony wood.
Ugh, ebony wood.
It wasn't just a crime against a specific people. It was a crime against humanity itself, a betrayal of our shared origin.
He throws out a number here that just stops you in your tracks. He notes that Africa lost two-thirds of its active population to the slave trade.
Two-thirds. Just sit with that for a second.
Just try to wrap your head around that number. It's not a city, it's not a nation, it's the active population of a continent. That's an apocalypse, a demographic collapse on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine.
It is. And that context is why the resistance was so fierce, so total. It wasn't just about taxes or borders. It was about refusing to be turned into raw material. It was a fight to remain human.
And speaking of refusing to be raw material, let's talk about how the colonizers talked about the people resisting them. Because Touré spends a good chunk of this speech just listing the insults, the labels thrown at these African leaders.
This is what he calls the vocabulary of oppression. It's a fascinating linguistic analysis on his part.
It really is.
He runs through the names of these resistance heroes and contrasts who they were to their own people versus what the Europeans call them. Touré understands that if you control the labels, you control the legitimacy of the struggle.
It's the classic freedom fighter versus terrorist dynamic. Your hero is my villain.
And the language they use was so incredibly dismissive. Let's run through a few of these because the contrast is just wild. Take Abdel Kader of Algeria. To his people, he's a brilliant military strategist, a unifier, a national hero. What did the French call him?
An insolent and stubborn Berber.
Insolent, like he's a naughty child refusing to eat his vegetables.
It's so belittling. It completely infantilizes him. It strips him of his military rank and reduces him to a nuisance.
Exactly. It denies his legitimacy as a political and military opponent. Then you have Alhaji Umar Tall. The Europeans dismissed him as a fanatic, turbulent marabout.
Okay, let's break that down. A marabout is a Muslim religious leader.
Right. So they are immediately painting him as this chaotic, crazy, religious zealot, fanatic, turbulent.
Turbulent, like he's just causing trouble for the sake of it, not for any coherent political reason.
It frames his resistance as irrational. If he's a fanatic, you don't have to negotiate with him. You don't have to understand his grievances. You just have to put him down.
And then it gets even darker, what they said about the Henzen of Dahomey.
This one is just straight propaganda. They accused him of being a barbarian who delights on drinking human blood.
Okay, that is straight up horror movie stuff. They're trying to make him an actual monster.
A vampire, of course. And it justifies any love of violence against him. If he's a monster, you don't have to treat him like a human leader. You can hunt him down. And it plays well in the newspapers back in Paris or London. Our brave boys are down there fighting blood-drinking savages.
It sells the war.
It sells the war and it absolves the conscience.
There's one about the Mahdi in Sudan that I found really interesting because it's a pun, isn't it? A deliberate, malicious twist of his name.
Yes, it's a clever, nasty linguistic twist. The Mahdi, which is a messianic title in Islam meaning the guided one, was twisted by the Europeans into Mad Mullah.
Which translates to what?
The chief who has gone mad.
So they literally called him a madman. They turned his holy title into an insult.
A very effective piece of psychological warfare.
Right.
And finally, Samari Touré, who is the central figure of this speech and a direct ancestor of the speaker.
Right.
The French labeled him a bloodthirsty petty king and slave dealer.
Petty king. That one really stings. It's so dismissive. But Sékou Touré, the president giving the speech, he flips this script completely. He argues that these insults are actually badges of honor. They prove these men were doing their jobs.
Right. That's his central point here, the no to submissiveness. The expert analysis is psychological. Resistance was about refusing to be, in Touré's words, irresponsible and unworthy. If the invader calls you stubborn, it means you aren't bending to their will. If they call you turbulent, it means you aren't quiet.
It's proof of life.
It is. There's a quote from Samari Touré himself that Sékou Touré shares, and it's so simple, but so profound. He said, "If a man does not want something, he should say no, bluntly and unambiguously."
No room for misinterpretation.
None. That no is the foundation of dignity. In a colonial context where the expectation is total, unquestioning submission, saying no is the most revolutionary, most dangerous thing you can do.
So let's talk more about Samari Touré, because Sékou Touré, the president, clearly sees him as the prototype of this resistance. He's the main case study here, and his story is, well, it's Hollywood material.
It really is. And it's important to note, the seminar itself was partly focused on Samari's empire and his legacy. He fought the French for 18 years.
18 years, from 1881 to 1898.
Think about that. That is an entire generation growing up knowing nothing but war against a modern industrial army.
And he didn't start out as a warlord or a prince. He was a trader, right? A merchant.
Yes, he sold plant products, livestock. He was what was known as a douala trader. This is important because it meant he understood logistics. He understood supply lines. He traveled. He knew the terrain and the people across a vast area.
But his career as a military leader, the catalyst for that is straight out of an action movie.
It is. His mother was captured.
The classic "they took his family" trope.
Exactly. His mother was captured by the Sisay clan during a local conflict. Now, Samri didn't have an army yet. He couldn't just storm their fortress. That would have been suicide. So he did something incredibly strategic.
What did he do?
He actually joined the Sisay troops. He enlisted in the army of his mother's captors, the army of his enemy.
No way.
Yes. Specifically to work from the inside, to free his mother.
That is dedication. Talk about playing the long game. And I assume he learned the art of war while he was on the inside.
He did. He proved to be an exceptional soldier. He rose through the ranks. He learned their tactics, their command structure, their strengths, their weaknesses. He was essentially a spy and a soldier at the same time.
So when he finally freed his mother and left.
He left with a PhD in their military methods. He started building his own power base from there. But Touré emphasizes that he wasn't just a fighter, he was a state builder.
That's a key distinction. Because the barbarian narrative that the French push says these guys just wanted to burn things and cause chaos. But Samari was actually building an empire.
A highly organized one. He was unifying the Mandingo populations in the regions of what are now Guinea, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, places like Bela, Konkan, Siguri. He created a cohesive nation known as the Wazulu Empire.
And his administration was fascinating. You mentioned he was a mix of decentralization and concentration.
Right, which sounds like a contradiction, but it was brilliant.
How does that work?
Well, he decentralized the day-to-day governance. He let local chiefs and local customs breathe. He didn't try to impose a single rigid culture on everyone, but he concentrated the three pillars of the state in his own hands: the military, the judiciary, and religious authority.
So local autonomy, but with a strong, unified center.
Exactly. He wanted a unified nation based on Islamic morals and law. He was building schools, organizing trade, administering justice. He even had his own workshops manufacturing and repairing firearms.
So when the French showed up, they weren't walking into a chaotic tribal zone with a few guys with spears.
No, not at all. They were walking into a functioning state with a disciplined, well-armed, and brilliantly led army.
An army that knew how to fight back.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Samari was a master of guerrilla warfare. He used mobility. He knew he couldn't stand toe-to-toe with French artillery in an open field every single time, so he moved. He would strike and vanish into the landscape. He even practiced scorched earth tactics, burning crops and villages in the path of the French army to deny them supplies.
A brutal tactic, but effective.
It was total war. But eventually the net began to close in.
He was facing an impossible situation.
He was. He was fighting a war on two fronts. He had the main French force, highly organized troops coming from Senegal in the west, and then he had British trade encroachment coming from Sierra Leone in the south.
Squeezed between two of the world's biggest empires.
And ultimately, according to Touré's account, it was betrayal that got him. He was captured on September 29, 1898, in a surprise assault at a place called Guillemot. It wasn't a climactic battlefield defeat so much as a swift, surgical ambush.
And then the French had a problem on their hands. What do you do with a leader like that? A living legend. You can't just kill him and make him a martyr right there in his homeland.
Exactly. The backlash would have been enormous. So they did what empires always do with charismatic leaders they can't control. They deported him.
Where to?
They sent him to an island off the coast of Gabon, along with his son.
Gabon seems to be the standard operating procedure for the French. You're too dangerous, go to Gabon. It's like the Siberia of French West Africa.
We'll see that pattern repeat itself, yes. But Touré notes something really important. Even Samari's enemies, the French commanders who fought him for years, in their own memoirs and official reports, they eventually admitted he was the most courageous and most intelligent of the African kings they faced.
Real recognize real, I guess.
They couldn't deny his skill, even as they were destroying his empire.
But Samari is just one star in this whole constellation of resistance. And this is where the speech really opens up. Touré takes us on a tour of the entire continent. It's like a roll call of heroes.
He does this very deliberately. He wants to show that Samari wasn't an anomaly. This was a continental pattern. And he starts with a very different kind of resistance right next door in Senegal. He talks about Cheikh Amadou Bamba.
Now, Bamba wasn't a general. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't command an army.
No. He was a Sufi mystic, a spiritual leader, the founder of the Muridiya Brotherhood, or Muridism. His resistance was cultural and religious. He preached the virtues of education, the sanctity of hard work, and strict nonviolence.
But the French still found him dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. Maybe even more dangerous than a general with an army.
Why is that?
Because a general can be defeated on the battlefield.
Yeah.
You can kill his soldiers. But Bamba was organizing the minds and souls of the people. He was giving them a center of gravity that wasn't the colonial administration. He was creating a parallel society, a state within a state, loyal only to God and to him.
So what did the French do?
They arrested him and, you guessed it, deported him to Gabon.
To Gabon again. And this leads to one of the most touching and, frankly, incredible details in the whole document.
It is an incredible historical coincidence. Both Sékou Touré, the warrior king, and Cheikh Amadou Bamba, the nonviolent saint, are in exile in Gabon at the very same time.
Did they meet?
They did. They met. They exchanged ideas. Two of the greatest resistance leaders of their generation, with completely opposite methods, finding common ground in exile. And Touré shares this detail. When Sékou died in exile in 1900, it was Bamba who prayed over his body.
That is such a powerful image, the sword and the spirit meeting at the end. It really shows that despite their different methods, they were fundamentally fighting the same fight.
It perfectly symbolizes the unity of the resistance that Touré is trying to highlight. And Bamba's story has this crazy sequel. He was in exile for 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days.
The number 7 appearing 3 times, that feels almost biblical, prophetic.
It certainly adds to his mystique among his followers. He was finally allowed to return to Senegal in 1902. The French tried to frame him again, this time claiming he was kidnapping children for rituals. But his popularity was so massive, the entire country was on the verge of revolt. They had to back off.
So he won. He won by simply being untouchable in the eyes of his people.
He outlasted them. His cultural power was greater than their military power.
But not everyone survived. The roll call gets pretty tragic from here. We have to talk about the ones who chose death over surrender.
This is a recurring and very powerful theme in the speech. The absolute refusal to be enslaved. Touré mentions Babemba Traoré in Mali. He was the king of Sikasso,
And he had a massive fortress, the Tata of Sikasso.
a legendary fortress. When the French artillery finally breached the walls on May 1st, 1898, instead of being captured and paraded as a trophy, he committed suicide.
And it wasn't just him. Mkwawa in Tanganyika, what's now mainland Tanzania, was fighting the Germans.
Same story. He fought them brilliantly for 7 years, from 1891 to 1898. He ambushed German columns, he used guerrilla tactics, he was a nightmare for them. But when he was finally cornered, sick, and with only a few followers left, he preferred suicide to being taken alive.
And Touré frames this not as an act of defeat or despair, but as the ultimate assertion of freedom.
Exactly. It's a statement, you can take my body, but you cannot take my living submission. My will remains free.
It's the live free or die motto taken to its most literal and tragic conclusion.
We also need to talk about Lat Dior Diath in Senegal. He has this great nickname that Touré mentions, the bow that can be bent endlessly without breaking.
That is a cool nickname. And his conflict, it was over a railway line, right? The Dakar-St. Louis line.
Yes. Now, usually, we're taught to think of railways as progress. Look, they're building infrastructure. They're modernizing.
Right, bringing civilization.
But Lat Dior saw right through it. He knew that railway wasn't being built for the benefit of the Senegalese people. It was being built to transport French troops quickly into the interior and to extract resources, mainly peanuts, out to the coast.
So it was a military supply line and an economic vacuum cleaner disguised as development.
Perfectly put.
Yeah.
He famously said, "You will never see me except to leave to my descendants the heritage of a chief who was the accomplice of the whites in the enslavement of his country." He fought against it because he understood the logistics of conquest. He saw the iron rails as chains.
We can't do this roll call without mentioning the women. Touré makes a point to highlight the queens who led the resistance.
Absolutely. It's crucial. He mentions Queen Mama Yoko in Sierra Leone, who opposed British troops, and of course, the legendary Queen Yaa Santewa in Ghana.
The War of the Golden Stool.
Yes, the War of the Golden Stool in 1900, when the British governor foolishly demanded to sit on the Golden Stool, which is the sacred symbol of the soul of the Ashanti nation. It was an ultimate insult.
And the male chiefs were hesitating, right?
They were. And Yaa Santewa stood up in the council and basically shamed them. She said, if the men of Ashanti will not go forward, then we will. The women will. And she led the rebellion herself.
She besieged the British in their fort in Kumasi for months.
She did. An incredible display of leadership. And like the others, she was eventually captured and exiled, sent all the way to the Seychelles with her family.
It really shows how terrified these empires were of these leaders. They couldn't just put them in a local jail. They had to ship them thousands of miles across oceans.
Because they were symbols. You have to remove the symbol to break the spirit of the people.
But there was one leader they couldn't remove, the one who actually won the big battle,
Menelik II of Ethiopia.
the modernizer.
Menelik is a fascinating case because he beat the Europeans at their own game. He didn't just resist. He modernized his country to be able to defeat them on their own terms. He abolished slavery. He introduced compulsory education, a postal system, a national currency.
And most importantly, he built a modern army.
A huge modern army. Touré says it's a 70,000-man army, heavily armed. Menelik was a brilliant diplomat. He played the European powers against each other to acquire modern rifles and artillery.
So when the Italians tried to take Ethiopia, claiming it as a protectorate based on a disputed treaty,
Menelik was ready. He famously said, "I cannot just sit back and do nothing while overseas forces have come to divide Africa amongst themselves."
and then came the Battle of Adua in 1896.
A total, shocking, and humiliating disaster for the Italians. A crushing defeat for a modern European army at the hands of an African one. It sent shockwaves to the entire world.
You couldn't believe it.
It completely shattered the myth of European invincibility. It kept Ethiopia independent, one of only 2 African nations never to be formally colonized, and it made Menelik a legend across Africa and the diaspora.
It proves that the inevitability of colonial conquest wasn't actually inevitable at all. It could be stopped with the right organization, the right leadership, and the right firepower.
Precisely. And Touré also gives a nod to others, like Osman Dan Fodio in Nigeria, a scholar and a saint who founded the Sokoto Caliphate and dreamed of a super-tribal empire based on the Quran. Touré argues that if the British hadn't interfered, Dan Fodio might have built a massive, unified African state.
So all of these stories, this whole continental roll call, it brings us to the so what of all this. Why is Touré listing all these people? He's not just a history nerd. He's building a bigger argument about culture.
This is section 5 of our dive, and it might be the most important part of his entire speech. Culture as the ultimate weapon.
He calls it the so-fall argument, right? The cultural argument.
Yes. And he points out that the seminar itself coincided with the 13th National Festival of Arts and Culture in Guinea. He says that's no accident.
He's linking political resistance directly to cultural celebration.
He's saying they are the same thing. He argues that resistance is, at its core, a cultural manifestation.
Okay, how so? What does he mean by that?
Well, think back to the guns in the books. What was the ultimate goal of colonialism? It wasn't just to take land and resources. It was to erase the African identity, what he called depersonalization.
To overwrite their software.
Exactly.
Eh.
So if the attack is on your identity, on your culture, then the most fundamental form of defense is to preserve your culture.
So keeping your language alive, practicing your religion, passing down your oral histories, maintaining your secret societies, that's all warfare.
It's all a form of resistance. Touré says, and this is a direct quote, "Culture is the very basic element, the justification of the armed struggle. You fight because you have a culture, an identity, a way of life to defend. Without that culture, you're just fighting for a piece of dirt. With culture, you're fighting for your soul."
He talks about secret societies and religious movements like the Messianic movements and what was then Zaire with Simon Kimbangu. These weren't just church groups. They were vehicles for political resistance.
They had to be. When open political dissent is banned and brutally suppressed, resistance goes underground. It takes refuge in culture and religion.
The places the colonizer can't easily reach.
Exactly. The colonizers couldn't penetrate the secret societies. They didn't speak the language. They didn't understand the rituals or the symbols. So those societies became the bunkers where the spirit of independence was kept alive, waiting for the right moment to reemerge.
And here's where Touré gets a little spicy with his contemporaries. He criticizes what he calls inexperienced theoreticians. Who is he talking about?
He's likely taking a subtle jab at more the doctrinaire Marxists or other revolutionaries of his time who believed that armed struggle was the only valid form of resistance. The people who look down on political or cultural action as being soft.
And he disagrees completely.
He argues that political and cultural struggle are just as important and are in fact part of the same continuous fight. He uses the example of Guinea's own independence to prove his point.
Right. Guinea didn't fight a massive war of independence in the same way that, say, Algeria or Kenya did.
Not at all. They had a different path. They voted no in the 1958 referendum organized by Charles de Gaulle.
This was the famous vote where France essentially said to its colonies, Do you want to be part of our new French community with limited autonomy, or do you want immediate, total independence? And Guinea was the only one to say.
We're out. We prefer poverty and freedom to riches and slavery.
And France's reaction was swift and punitive.
Oh, they immediately pulled out everything. Administrators, doctors, teachers, they ripped phones out of the walls, took the light bulbs, even destroyed government records. They wanted to make an example of Guinea.
But Touré argues that no vote was a political act with the same weight as an armed conflict.
Precisely. He says it was a cultural rejection of domination. It was an assertion of their identity. He says the ultimate goal, whether by arms or by vote, is the determination to be the authentic expression of oneself.
So whether you do that with a gun, a ballot box, or a religious ceremony, the fundamental goal is the same: to be yourself.
And that leads us directly to the legacy of all this. What does this mean for the future, for the generation he's speaking to in 1982? He calls them the continuators.
Continuators. I love that word. It implies that the job isn't done. The struggle continues.
It isn't done at all. He says the struggle has simply shifted. It's no longer about expelling foreign armies from the soil. It's now about economic, social, and cultural development. It's about building the nations that the resistance fighters died to make possible.
He uses this beautiful metaphor of the cocoon. Can you explain that?
It's a lovely and very powerful image. He says that during the darkness of colonialism, when Africa was militarily overpowered, its spirit didn't die. It took refuge in a cocoon of its own values. It wrapped itself in its culture, its music, its stories, its languages, its religions, to survive the long winter of colonial rule.
And now, in the post-independence era.
Now the butterfly emerges from the cocoon. He says Africa now opens up to the world, ready to offer a message of fraternity and humanity. But, and this is the key part, it opens up on its own terms, having preserved its essential identity, its soul.
He really emphasizes that this next phase is a job for African historians and intellectuals.
Yes, this is a direct charge to them. He says we must restore historical truth. He believes that as long as the history of Africa is written primarily by the colonizers, Africa will remain mentally colonized. African scholars need to do the hard work, the kind of work this speech represents, to reclaim their own narrative.
He rejects the barbarism label completely. He makes a point to remind everyone that Africa had its own laws, its own ethics, its own aesthetics for thousands of years before the first European ship arrived.
It's a powerful call for what he terms genuine African unity. He believes that if Africans understand this shared history of resistance, if a child in Guinea sees that Samori Touré was fighting the same fundamental fight as Mkwawa in Tanzania and Menelik in Ethiopia, then that shared heritage becomes the bedrock for a unified future.
It connects the dots across a map that was carved up by foreigners.
Exactly. It erases the colonial borders in the mind, even if they still exist on paper.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try to distill the key takeaways here. What are the big ideas you should walk away with after hearing about this speech?
I think there are three main things that are really critical. First is the idea that resistance was universal. There was no such thing as a peaceful occupation. As Touré says, no square meter was occupied without a fight.
Right, so the idea that Africans just passively accepted colonial rule is a complete myth.
A deliberate myth. Second is that resistance took countless forms. It wasn't just armies clashing. It was suicide as a final act of freedom. It was diplomacy. It was religious teaching. It was voting no. It was refusing to speak the colonizers' language. It was a total, multifaceted struggle.
And the third key takeaway.
Third, and maybe most importantly, is that the civilizing mission was a lie. It was a facade for pure resource extraction, what Touré called the instinct of profit. And the tools of that mission, the books and the guns, were two sides of the same coin, both aimed at domination.
That image is going to stick with me. The book as a weapon, the library as an armory.
It's a provocative thought to leave with. If culture was the primary target of colonialism, if the ultimate goal was to erase the African mind and replace it with a European one, then the restoration and celebration of that culture is the ultimate act of revolution.
It means that speaking your indigenous language, knowing your actual pre-colonial history, and honoring your ancestors isn't just heritage or a hobby. It's a radical political act of defiance.
Precisely. It's continuing the fight on the cultural battlefield.
Sékou Touré ends the speech with a sign-off that really just encapsulates the energy of the whole text. It's not a long, flowery conclusion.
He doesn't need one. He simply says, ready for the revolution.
Ready for the revolution. It's a call to stay vigilant, to keep building, and to never, ever forget the price that was paid for that vertical sovereignty they reclaimed.
A powerful message from 1982 that, you could argue, still resonates very strongly today.
Absolutely. Well, that's our deep dive for today. We unpacked the myth, we walked through the Hall of Heroes, and we looked at culture as the ultimate weapon.
It was a pleasure to explore this history. It's a text that really challenges you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep digging, keep questioning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Goodbye.